So welcome everyone, welcome to this webinar with Emma Millar from Vinters. And this is all about running your social venture and how you move from that startup phase to becoming more sustainable in all different areas you need to think of. I'll hand over to Emma.
Good morning everyone, thank you for joining me today. It's a nice small group, but hopefully that means we can have a bit more of a discussion at the end if you do have any points that you would like to pick up on. So yes, as Jane said, very much the purpose of this particular presentation is running a social venture, so looking at expanding operations and impact. So yes, let's kick off. Running a social venture, expanding operations and impact. So just to give you a little bit of background about me, I am Emma Millar, a senior associate in the Vinters Charities and Social Ventures team. I've worked with the firm for a number of years, particularly specialising more recently in working with social ventures. And actually what's really nice and what I'm starting to see with a number of clients now is that they are starting to reach a bit more of a sort of mature phase where they're moving away from bootstrapping and startup operations and really starting to move more into that space of sustainable service delivery, which is fantastic to see. But obviously the needs of an operation of that nature are quite different to when you are in that very early incubation phase. So the purpose of today's presentation really is just to touch on some of the legal framework and operational considerations that can help the pieces of the puzzle fall into place for that sustainable development. So just moving on then to the outline for today's presentation. We're going to pick up from our last session, and I think a few of you are new to today's session, but just by way of a recap, and obviously all of these presentations that SEEE have been putting on are available on the website, so do feel free to go back and find my last session, which we went through quite a bit of detail of the actual sort of startup, and particularly focusing on the legal structures and formalities for how you actually look to create a purpose-led business, but to pick up on some of those 5 key question areas for social ventures. We're going to use these really as the outline for today's session, so exploring in more detail how these issues can be developed and can be managed as you grow your company. So taking governance as a starting point, we'll be looking at who has control of your organisation and looking at the constitutional frameworks that you have in place for your company. People, obviously you may be working with founders, you may be a founder yourself, but there will come a point where you need to expand operations to the point where you are looking to build out a broader staff team to assist you. You might be looking to bring volunteers on board or outsourcing certain activities to consultants, and all of that needs a little bit of consideration as to how you regulate those relationships. Funding, obviously we wouldn't get very far talking about social ventures without considering how they might be funded, and there's a few different options that we'll touch on, but looking particularly at grant funding, service delivery, and also some of the expanding opportunities for equity investment in social ventures. IP, perhaps not obviously critical or mission critical, should I say, to every social venture, but I would say that every social venture probably should have some degree of valuable IP, even if it is just your name and branding. That is very integral to the cachet of you working and the goodwill of your organisation. So very important to protect that. And there may be more underlying fundamental IP that really sits at the heart of your service delivery or activities that you would want to ensure is properly protected. And last but by no means least, because it is absolutely mission critical, is purpose. So looking very much at how you embed your organisation's purpose and how you record that impact going forward. So looking at securing funding, how are social ventures funded? If you were able to join us for the last session, you might recognise this, but this is just to flag a few of the key ways that social ventures can be funded, and to give a few examples there. So investment and debt, we're looking at traditional funding there, for example, approaching your bank for a loan facility and using that as you would really in the same sense as any commercial organisation. Revenue, I see a number of social ventures actually that use this as an integral income stream for their organisation. So the trading services and activity from their delivery of goods or services that are very much still furthering their organisation's core purpose. Grant funding, traditionally very project driven, but I do have to say we have seen some green shoots of grant funders being a little bit more appreciative. I think particularly given the past sort of 15 months or so, that organisations, be they charitable or social ventures, do have core operational costs that do need to be covered. There is a need to pay staff to keep the lights on, and that is actually perfectly valid and critical funding. So that certainly is something that we have seen some movement on. Probably the point worth mentioning there for grant funding is that some more conservative funders still may be a little shy of funding certain types of social ventures, particularly those that have a shareholding structure for the underlying company, because they still have a little bit of reticence about the opportunity for private benefit and the funneling, if I can put it that way, of grant funds, potentially even way be it further down the line to individuals by way of dividend payments, if the company structure allows for that. Some, I do have to say, actually are a bit more forward thinking, which I think is absolutely right in this day and age, that they recognise that actually social ventures have a very crucial role to play alongside traditional charities, and they do have a bit more of a dynamic constitutional base that I think gives them some benefits in terms of flexibility, and they are still very much addressing some really integral social and environmental issues that funders, traditional grant funders, should be getting on board with. But yeah, I think that situation will improve, but it might be a bit more incremental change there. So something that we actually are seeing a bit more momentum on, particularly with social ventures, and you might argue that is because they feel slightly shut out of traditional grant funding arrangements, is the rise of crowdfunding. So sourcing donations from a larger section of the public. The funds involved tend to be smaller from individual donors. It tends to be project or idea driven largely, because that's the more obvious hook for people to want to get on board with supporting your organisation. And the crowdfunding can actually take a number of different forms. So I mentioned donations. Some of it can be donation based, others can be actually a bit more sort of reward incentive, so a little bit of a lump sum fund, and further down the line you will receive X by way of appreciation and thank you for your donation. And then, not the right model for everybody, but particularly if your organisation perhaps has a bit more of a valuable IP within the company structure and underlying business model, you may have the opportunity to look to commercialise that by way of a licensing arrangement, or I think rarer still, but I have seen it in some cases, is looking actually more towards the franchise model, so where you actually offer another organisation to entirely replicate your business and branding. And certainly in the commercial sphere, one of the most obvious examples of that is the McDonald's restaurant franchise. You see them obviously popping up here, there and everywhere, and it's very much a carbon copy of every other one. They're not necessarily right for everybody, but it may be an option to scale up quickly for some organisations. So to give a little bit more detail as to the types of funding and securing social ventures with some examples here, you'll see that what I have here largely is the sort of funding landscape for social ventures. So on the one side, you'll see that we've got the very kind of mission driven, those looking more to, and on the flip side, those looking more towards sort of profit and return. So mission driven, we have grants, so traditionally philanthropic, and a few names there that sort of obviously big players in the sector would be Lottery Community Fund, Comic Relief, and as I'm sure you're all aware, the main sort of upside of grant funding is that is not repayable money unless you were very unfortunate to fall foul of any clawback provisions in the grant funding arrangement. And even then, actually, I have to say that's a very high threshold. I've never seen that happen, actually, and it would normally be if an organisation really used those funds in an inappropriate way that was clearly beyond the scope of the original grant application fund. But it is worth noting a couple of points there in terms of grant funding is that you will normally be contracting on the basis of the grant funder's terms and conditions. So you may have limited scope to negotiate there. So one point that does come from that is just ensuring that you are very comfortable with the scope of which they have given you those particular funds, particularly if it is project driven, and you are comfortable with the reporting obligations that sit with you to maintain the confidence of your grant funder, because some of those may go on actually for a considerable length of time. Hopefully it's all fairly sort of hand in glove with the impact and reporting obligations that you will be undertaking anyway, but just something to ensure that you are comfortable with the scope of that. We then move on to social investment and impact investment. And I have to say, I mean, you may have come across this yourselves, but those two phrases tend to be used quite interchangeably. And there isn't always a very clear demarcation as to which is which, what means what. I'm going to have a stab at that myself as to the differences I see there. So in terms of social investment, and I have to say this is a definition that I have cribbed from Good Finance, because I think they've summarised it very nicely, is the use of repayable finance to help an organisation achieve a social purpose, often with interest payable at the end. Impact investment is investment with the intention to make a social and/or environmental measurable impact as well as a financial return. And you may say, actually, that all sounds a little bit like semantics. The difference I see and have seen from discussions with those perhaps more sort of on the impact investment space is that when the chips are down, with impact investment, it may be more likely that the impact element of the organisation and the purpose behind it will be prioritised over the financial return. And that's possibly less likely to be the case with a social investment. But in either case, as I say, I mean, that they are similar in that sense. As I think my take on it is that impact investment is maybe a little bit more, again, of a deep dive on top of that, but some very key questions that I think are applicable to both types of those investment finances is what is the impact you are trying to make? How are you measuring that impact and keeping yourself accountable? And equally, I think, because it is very much a different shift from grant funding, because there is clearly the repayable element, you will have investors on board, not just for a particular project, but potentially actually a longer term whilst you repay that initial investment. So I think it needs a more holistic due diligence approach before you look to undertake that type of investment. So it's very much looking to have your house in order. Do you have the right contracts in place? Have you documented your IP ownership? Have you prepared a detailed business plan for how you will generate surplus to repay that initial investment? And be very, very clear as to what social impact your organisation is trying to achieve with that particular chunk of investment funding. What I've seen from some organisations that have gone down the social investment or impact investment route is that they found the initial process in some ways actually a lot more arduous than going through a grant application funding form, which you may know they can be pretty rigorous in themselves, but there's a bit more on top of them actually for investor scrutiny. So very much making sure that you're comfortable going into that type of arrangement. And then we move more towards slightly the more traditional equity funding VC option. Although I do have to say there is definitely a burgeoning scene of investors that are used to and comfortable dealing with social ventures. So we've mentioned Mustard Seed there, which is one of the big players. So they will be taking a shareholding stake in the company, obviously only applicable for those organisations that have an underlying share structure. But if you are looking to partner with an organisation like Mustard Seed and the like, one of the benefits there is that because they do hold themselves out as specialists in the social venture sector, they will be used to dealing with, for example, community interest companies, other organisations that have some restrictions on use of assets or dividend caps, and very much would be looking to align themselves with an organisation that is purpose-led. So hopefully you will have a bit more of sort of the top-down buy-in from your shareholders in helping you achieve your community or social environmental purpose. But as you can see, it's a very wide landscape. There is a lot of opportunities out there. There's a lot of information out there. At the end of the presentation, I have included a series of links that hopefully will give you a bit of a steer. So please do feel free to have a look at those in your own time and see if there's some information that might be helpful there. So looking at governance then next, and how you make key organisational decisions. What we have here is a recap of basic governance for a company. So it's the decision-making split that sits between the directors and the members or shareholders. And just a very quick recap, members are essentially akin to shareholders, but in an organisation that is limited by guarantee and doesn't therefore have a share capital. Shareholders fairly obviously being the people with ultimate backstop constitutional powers for an organisation that has shares. And some of the decisions that will sit with members or shareholders as decreed by company law will be things like the right to approve any amendments to the company's articles of association. That is a decision that has to be taken by the members or the shareholders. More general day-to-day high-level strategic decisions for the actual direction of the company sit with directors. So there is a bit of a split there, and the key documents that you'll see there on the slide that govern that relationship will be potentially a members or shareholders agreement, particularly if you have an external group of members or shareholders who are not necessarily your directors. You will want to regulate how you interact with those individuals. The company's articles of association, critical key document that is the absolute underlying framework for how a company works, but it also does form a binding contract between the way that all of the participants in this arrangement work, so how the company interacts with its directors, how the company interacts with its shareholders, members, and then we have the backdrop as well of underlying company law, the most relevant and recent obviously being the Companies Act 2006, for the bulk of how companies need to maintain their operations, and also the accompanying judge-made case law for particular issues that have progressed through the courts and set precedents for a particular issue. So to look at that in a little bit more detail, and governance details for members and shareholders, you'll see there actually there's quite a bit of detail. But there are some special needs for social ventures in particular. And as I mentioned before, particularly around aligning your shareholders and members with the company's social mission. If you have either you're starting off with an existing group of external members or shareholders, or you are looking to bring them on board by way perhaps of a VC equity finance, for example. So ensuring that you have the buy-in to your purpose and that those individuals agree with your objectives is really important to making sure that everybody's on the same page. But equally, I think it has to be appreciated that having a wider group of stakeholders by way of members and shareholders can be a great sounding board for your organisation and a champion for what you do. So there are definite benefits if it is an appropriate model for your organisation. But there are a few things to think about how we get that right. And how do we do that? there's a few options, which you'll see sort of set out there at the bottom bullet point of the slide, with varying degrees of legal robustness, if I can put it that way. So we've mentioned the members and shareholders agreement. That by far would be the most robust way to manage the relationship between members, shareholders, and the company, because it is a contractual, legally binding document that will set out the expectations of the parties. If that's not quite right for you, you may want to consider an application form if you are looking to onboard new external members or shareholders. So you will then be requiring those individuals to make declarations at the outset that they appreciate your social mission, that they are happy to act in furtherance of it. So then you do still have a bit of a paper trail of actually, you said you would do this when you came on board, which can be helpful. Or if you're starting out and you already have that wider group of members, or you think actually we'd just like something that's a little bit more behind the scenes, you might want to consider implementing a code of conduct, which can be seen as a bit more of a passive document, but really what I would say that does is it's you developing a code of behaviours, expected standards for your members and shareholders, and again understanding that the obligations that are passing to those individuals, that they will conduct themselves in a way that is in furtherance and in support of your social mission. So there's a few options there, and for a code of conduct in some organisations, it may be appropriate to also think about how you might interplay that, for example, with a disciplinary process, particularly if for membership-based organisations in particular, if individuals are sort of out there in the wider world with your brand and undertaking activities, or holding themselves out very openly as members of your organisation, then actually having a little bit more teeth to how you look to manage those expectations. There's a few things again that we can put in place behind the scenes to manage those relationships. Looking at directors, now as we mentioned, obviously directors are responsible for the day-to-day strategic operations of the company. All directors owe duties to the company, including the non-executives, because that is sometimes something that we have seen has been missed by companies. And they do also have collective responsibility for affecting the decisions of the board and the strategic direction of the companies. One point that I think is worth going into a little bit more detail on is for social ventures with an embedded social purpose. So for example, the objects clause in a community interest company, or the social and environmental statement in a B Corp, that enshrined social purpose in the Articles of Association creates a slightly different emphasis on the fiduciary duty and obligations of the company's director under company law. So just to give you the context for that, for a normal profit-driven commercial company, the obligations and fiduciary duty of a director is to act in a way that he considers in good faith would be most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members/shareholders as a whole. Now, where the company is not run for the benefit of its members, but instead in furtherance of that particular mission, the directors actually need to operate to promote the success of the company in furtherance of that chosen mission. So in that sense, actually, it's much more like the responsibility of a trustee in a charity, where everything comes back to the ultimate backstop of, is this in the best interest of the charity? If you are a director of a social purpose-led business and a company, your ultimate fiduciary duty is, am I acting in furtherance of the chosen purpose of this organisation? So it's always having that social and or environmental mission front and centre of everything that the directors do. So I think that's a subtle but important distinction to make between social ventures and normal for-profit companies. And another point that I think is worth noting, when, particularly if you're getting to the stage of actually broadening out and bringing new people on board, if you have been a founder or work very closely with the founder, and you now realise actually it's time to get some other people around the table to broaden out the expertise we have there, director appointment letters are really crucial in managing the expectations of who those individuals are, what obligations you're going to be passing on to them. And I think another point that's worth just tacking on the end there as well is that if you are bringing directors onto the board to deliver particular services in addition to their usual director duties, I would strongly recommend going for a hybrid consultancy agreement arrangement, again, just to really sort of bottom out the obligations and expectations of service delivery that you will have with that individual, because you won't have the underlying safety net, if I can put it that way, of an employment relationship and contract necessarily. So outline of directors' duties. We've got 7 duties for directors, which are all set out in the Companies Act, and most of them I think are fairly self-explanatory. Those snapshots sort of largely do capture them, but just to touch on a few in further detail. So in terms of promoting the success of the company, as we mentioned, if it's a social venture company, we have got that shift of looking to promote the purposes. And there's a few factors that I think are useful for directors to consider in how they might do that. So thinking about the likely consequences of any long-term decisions, considering the interests of the company's employees, if there are any, or certainly any wider stakeholders, the need to foster good business relationships with suppliers, customers, stakeholders, commissioners, whoever it may be that's relevant for the particular organisation. I think these days, actually thinking about the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment, even actually if there isn't an obvious environmental thrust to what they're doing, I think we're all increasingly aware of the climate crisis and UN SDGs, and actually the need for business just to be better. So yeah, I think that's absolutely something that for a social business that wants to hold itself out as being a more ethical way of operating, that's something that should come into play. And obviously the need as well to act fairly between members and shareholders. So we wouldn't want any circumstances where we get directors picking favourites between directors and shareholders and members. The duty to exercise reasonable care and skill, again, very similar to the trustee test, if you're familiar with that. And actually, just as with charitable trustees, that test is made up of 2 elements. So there's a sort of general knowledge, skills and experience that any reasonable person will be expected to have of carrying out the same functions as the director in that company. So an objective test there. And then also a subjective test. So if that individual comes to the board with particular skills and expertise that they hold themselves out as having, you as an organisation are entitled to rely on that and the fact that the director has said that they have those skills. So the most obvious example there is if you appoint somebody with an accountancy background, in particular to fulfil a financial function on the board, not to say that all financial decisions then need to rest on the shoulders of that individual, because there is collective responsibility, but you would be entitled to expect that individual, for example, to pick up on any obvious question marks in the accounts, or just sort of raise some financially prudent points of challenge and to chip in where relevant there. And in terms of conflicts, directors need to avoid situations that might arise that could have a direct or indirect interest that conflicts or possibly may conflict. It's very broadly drafted there, with the interests of the charity. And it particularly applies to the exploitation of any property, information or opportunities. And one important thing to note there is that it is irrelevant whether the company itself could benefit from that particular opportunity. It comes down very much to being sort of seen to be transparent in dealings with the wider world, that sort of whiter than white expectation. The helpful safety valve, if I can put it that way, for companies as opposed to charities in that sense, is that the directors do have the ability to authorize that conflict. So if it's felt that actually that opportunity property transfer, whatever it might be, actually is ultimately in the company's best interests, the directors can authorize that decision, but actually it needs to go beforehand to the shareholders or members of the company to give it ultimate sign off. So it is one of those sort of, again, constitutional backstop powers that ultimately sits with the members or shareholders of the company. So then we'll be moving on to talking about purpose and measuring and reporting impact. And some of you may be very familiar with this, and I know Jane has had some sessions as well on the great toolkit that Social Enterprise East of England has produced to help organisations monitor and record that. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, and I don't hold myself out as being an expert on this by any means. There are some people that know a lot more about this, and I would certainly recommend that you go and have a look at them. But just a little mention here of some resources that I think are particularly helpful in this sense are a lot of content put out by NPC, New Philanthropy Capital, who are doing some great work, particularly around some very practical tools for the implementation of the theory of change. So if you're not familiar with it, theory of change is a way for purpose-led organisations to think and describe about what they aim to achieve and how they hope to achieve it. It's the underlying idea that an organisation will achieve greater impact if it actually takes the time to consider how it can make the most difference. It sets goals and objectives and then crucially tests itself against the evidence that it is collecting in that sense. Which leads to that impact measurement piece, as you will see there on the slide. And I have to say, from what I've seen from my clients that have been undertaking this type of activity, that's actually very challenging to do. If you're going to really be sufficiently robust with your impact measurement, I think there's a couple of key things that you are going to need to do. And that, firstly, is long-term research. So thinking actually, what are the longer term outcomes of how we're operating, and therefore what is the sustainability of the activities and interventions that we as an organisation are undertaking. And it's then that comparative research piece as well of how are we able to properly determine that it's our interventions and activities that is having the positive impact and making the difference that we want to see. So it's then sort of actually drawing data from a very wide circle of others outside your beneficiary circle to do that sort of compare and contrast exercise. And once you feel like you are in a position and you have collated that information, it's the impact reporting piece. So communicating the difference that you made to the people you're trying to help or the issues you are trying to improve. And I think it's crucial that we make that information accessible, and it's a very clear distillation of your activities and impact. And it goes without saying as well that I think that goes beyond just annual reporting obligations. And I think it's helpful to think about this actually in terms of what reports are you sending to funders and supporters, particularly, for example, if you're grant funding, board reports in terms of actually how are you maintaining communications amongst the directors, how are they keeping proper checks and accountability on a more regular basis for the company's activities. Communications internally with staff and volunteers. I think actually in terms of bringing everybody within the organisation on board with you and making them enthusiastic about what you're doing, a great way to do that is to bring them on board and make available to them that information of you are helping achieve this. You are a critical and key piece of the puzzle to do all of this. So that's important. Equally, you can think about broader communications that you might be having, so fundraising materials that you might be putting out, even what's on your website or brochures for leaflets for services, etc. Anything that's sort of engaging and where you want to be making a bit of a clarion call for your organisation to the general public. I think the more that we can look to actually hammer home the importance and impact of social ventures in addressing the plethora of social and environmental issues that we're all currently facing at the moment, then so much the better, because it is hopefully a real sort of rallying call for these are the businesses that we should be supporting and engaging with, because they are making a difference. But that comes back to being able to demonstrate that you are making a difference. So yes, just a little bit more on the theory of change there. So you'll see I've included a theory of change diagram from MPC. So they've tried to distill this into a very helpful flow chart to help organisations think all this through. But my takeaway from looking at this is that theory of change, it's a great tool and a flexible approach, looking at various activities in an organisation, the required change process to achieve the desired outcome. And NPC recommends breaking down a theory of change review into 3 areas: services, so the activities supporting individuals and organisations directly; campaigns, so activities that aim for more general policy changes, so your traditional sort of awareness raising campaigns in that sense; and organisations. And that, I think, can either be looking internally, whether there are changes that you need to look at as an organisation to make you a more efficient entity, be that digitalisation, IT rollout, etc., or actually is it looking in a little bit more of a joined up fashion between your services and your campaigns in tandem to ensure that they are fully aligned there with the activity that you are looking, an outcome you're looking to achieve. And one thing that the theory of change process does recommend is that it can be helpful to take a bit of a backward mapping look at how you undertake all of this. So considering actually what is the desired outcome that the organisation wants to achieve, and then what are the processes that are required to achieve that. So there's a bit of backfilling in that sense of, this is where we want to get to, what do we need to get there? But it's very much a very critical and root and branch and honest, I think, review and challenge of how are we doing things at the moment, what can we be doing better, and what do we need to be achieving ultimately to further our stated social mission. Do I see that we've just had a question pop up? Sorry.
There's a question, yeah.
Yeah, impact reporting could be data, but also maybe stories from people who have experienced the positive impact. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think actually that kind of that personal engagement piece is so important, because it just breathes life into what you are doing, what you are trying to achieve. So I think that's a really fantastic idea, and it just sort of resonates, I think, more with people as to what you're hoping to achieve and how you are doing that. So yeah, and I think there's a couple of benefits to that in terms of giving a voice to your stakeholders, because you know one of the things that we've seen as a bit of a criticism, certainly levelled at the Charity Commission, is and by charities more generally, is this sort of saviour complex, and actually a bit less appreciation and reflection of who our beneficiaries are, and that is one of the areas that I think social ventures do tend to sort of hold themselves out as being a bit different, because they have that kind of more, well, certainly for smaller organisations, a bit more of a grassroots engagement. So if you can give voice to those people that are delivering or receiving your services, then absolutely, so much the better. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So in terms of impact measurement, we're very much looking at a results-based accountability approach. So I think asking these 3 questions of how much did we do, how well did we do it, is anyone better off, being the absolute clincher, should ensure alignment between an organisation's impact and ensuring that impact is more than just superficial, and that the organisation is using that reporting and monitoring to inform its future behaviours. And I think one of the things there is actually the recognition that having scope to improve and to grow is not a bad thing. It gives you a direction of travel, and that's something actually to be welcomed if you're appreciating that we might not be getting everything right at this stage, but this is where we know we need to improve and want to improve. And then actually you've got that journey for where you need to take the organisation, and some benchmarks to then sort of measure future successes again. So actually You know, you might say that it's all the way you spin it, but I do think there are some real genuine benefits to taking that sort of honest approach with the impact that your organization has. And actually, just to give a couple of examples of some impact reporting on the next slide, we've got SolarAid and Ecology Project, both of whom have worked quite closely with NPC in their impact reporting process. So you'll see actually what they've got some very punchy visuals for the impact they're delivering. They've got numbers backed up by the purpose and beneficiaries that they're actually reaching from their activities. So NPC's principles for impact reporting are ensuring that you are making clear what your stated purpose is with defined aims, that there are coherent activities that you are undertaking to achieve those aims, you're demonstrating results, and you're taking an evidence-based approach. And as we were just saying, actually, that there's a real sort of lessons learned approach as well for the activities and what's been done to date and where the organisation can grow. So we're going to move on to talking as well about building a team. So some organisations you might not be there yet, because it certainly definitely is a bit of a gear change to being founder driven. Sorry, we've got another comment. So the crucial bit is not to forget to establish the baseline right at the beginning of an activity or intervention to measure. Yeah, absolutely agree with that as well. Thank you, Karina. Yes, so the basic company structure in terms of staff. So you'll see at the top there we have the social venture company as an independent legal entity. Sitting beneath that we have our board of directors, and potentially if you're at that stage you may then have an expanded group of employed staff sitting below that. And to go through a little bit more detail as the company control structure, you'll see there actually we've broken down the staff element into executive directors and chief exec, and then beneath that again other operational staff. And you'll see actually we've got a bit of a flow there of delegated power and the flip side of that being accountability. And I think the key takeaway from this particular demonstration is to really consider the reporting lines and communication channels to ensure that there is a clear relationship between the exercise of those undertaking those delegated functions and the accountability that then needs to go back up to those above. And my take on that as well is that the buck stops ultimately still with the board of directors having that overall strategic control, and then thinking again back to the fiduciary duties of the directors, their responsibility to be furthering the social mission of the company, and therefore actually the accountability that they have to the company itself. Now some of these reporting lines and obligations will be enshrined by documentation automatically. So articles of association will very, very usually have the ability for the directors to delegate their activities to senior executive staff within the organisation, or to set up committees for particular sort of functions that they might want to, special task groups, etc. Equally for executive staff and chief executives, the obligations and expectations that come from fulfilling the delegated activities down from the board will often be included in employment contracts. So we're regulating the relationship there in that sense, and the same equally for further staff lower down in the organisation. And one point really there just to pick up on is you'll see we've got a few examples there of how you can look to document and regulate that delegation accountability relationship. So shareholders agreement, director appointments letters, which we've already talked about. I think actually a really crucial one to get right as well is consultancy agreements. So if you're engaging with somebody actually as an entirely third party outside of the organisation, being very clear about the way on which you expect those activities to be conducted, the rights and remits that that individual or company has to contract on your behalf, to subcontract, the actual activities they're going to be undertaking, and how regularly they will be updating you with the performance and progress of any particular delegated tasks is absolutely a crucial one to get right. Managing people in a social venture, if you have an expanded group of staff, we've got a few options. Now, I have to say incentive schemes will certainly not be right for every organisation. But if you do have a shareholding structure and you feel there is a need and a want to reward some or all of the staff with equity in the business, to give them that sort of vested interest, if you like, there are a number of ways that you can tailor a scheme of that nature, but it does need to be very clearly thought through. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but we do have, particularly in our corporate team, people who can assist in that way. But when I have seen socially driven businesses float the idea of incentive schemes, I think it needs very careful thinking through, particularly whether awarding equity and the opportunity for personal benefit in any way undermines the constitutional integrity or asset lock that an organisation might have. And equally, if you are a purpose-led business that has imposed an embedded social purpose and an asset lock, but isn't externally regulated, so you're not a KIC or a B Corp in that sense, I think you might still want to think about the external stakeholder presentation. So, for example, if you are grant funded, though, still in that sense, which I have seen for some organisations, grant funders may be a little wary of an organisation wanting to open up an equity shareholding incentive scheme in this way, because it raises the same issues really of private benefit, in much the way as that some of those organisations might be a bit reluctant to fund a KIC that has the ability to make dividend payments. But it may be something that might work for your organisation. Actually, I think one that probably does work across the board is the general sort of goodwill and purpose impact piece. You'll no doubt be aware that there's a number of studies that actually have shown that there is better engagement from staff that are motivated in furthering the company's mission and on board with delivering your purpose. So that's sort of more holistic approach to, you are a piece of the puzzle that's helping us to achieve this, and thank you for that. Actually, it does really mean a lot to employees. And volunteers, like a charity, you may actually also be able to attract volunteers, but this does come with some additional requirements for managing the expectations and relationships there, because you don't have that underlying employment relationship that will automatically bottom out issues like, for example, if that volunteer produces some intellectual property content for you, who owns that? Well, actually the default would be, if they're not an employee, that would sit with the volunteer, but understandably you probably want to have control over that. So a contractual relationship to manage issues like that is very important. So IP strategy, actually following on from that, and international expansion, outlining an IP strategy for your organisation. Now, as I say, not every social venture will be entirely driven by underlying IP, but it still is very helpful to think about what content you have and how you might want to protect that. So one of the first steps there is actually identifying the creators. So that actually follows on quite nicely from the point we made about volunteers, but thinking it's an exercise of factual due diligence, thinking about the capacity that individuals might have created IP. So volunteers, but also it's a very similar situation for consultants. So unless you have contractually agreed otherwise with the consultant, the default position is that they will own any IP that they create. That is the antithesis of an employee, where the default position is you as the employer will own the IP that they have created in the course of their employment. So thinking about the content that you need to use, how you want to use it, and who has created it, and therefore actually is there a little bit of work that we need to do in terms of tying that down, ensuring that you as the company have the right rights to use and exploit that IP as you need to. Which then leads us on to actually obtaining the IP for the company. And the way that we would normally do that is, if you were able to access and have full control over that IP, would be an assignment of the IP, where the individual that has created that fully consents to you owning and operating and using that IP in whichever way you want. Or if that individual wants to retain some degree of control around and actually ultimately still have the ownership rights sitting with them, but are very happy for you to go out and use it for particular specified purposes, then we're looking at a license. Upshot, I suppose, is that assignments in some ways are ultimately better, because they will give you absolute freedom to do whatever you want with that material. Licenses, actually, as long as they're broad enough to give you what you need to, they're fine. So it may be a sort of negotiation point, actually, given on the relative sort of bargaining strength of the parties, who created the IP and in what capacity, as to whether you fall in the assignment or license camp. But really the takeaway there is that as long as you have what you need to for the purposes you need to use it, you should be fine. If you do have the benefits of either having received an assignment of IP, or you're clear at the outset that actually you have full control of the IP anyway, because it's been created by your employees, or perhaps you're a founder and you've created it all yourself anyway, so you know it sits with you, you might then want to think about how you protect those rights. And again, actually, that won't necessarily work for everything. So, for example, one of the most common pieces of content that organizations rely on is copyrighted material. So if you've produced materials for the way that you deliver a service, copyright is an unregistered right. It arises automatically from the point at which an original work has been created. You don't need to then do anything on top of that to protect it. That's very much contrasted with, for example, something that might be a patentable technology, which then you obviously do need to go through the fairly onerous process of the Patent Office application. So absolutely thinking about what IP you have and whether it falls into something that will need particular IP protection. And another point to add there as well is that even if you don't, as I say, have an underlying business model that relies on IP, you will have a name and a brand. And if that's particularly important to you, you may want to think about undertaking a trademarking exercise to officially register and protect that. You will have some lesser rights if that's not feasible for you, and it's known as passing off, where if you've been operating with a particular business trading name and you've generated goodwill in the sector with your stakeholders and you're known in that sense, if you then come across someone who has been doing similar things with your name, you will have the right to ask them to stop. But it's not as robust as, please stop using our brand and our name because we have this trademark registered at the Intellectual Property Office. But I do have to say is that trademarking is a very, very expensive process. So if you're not in a position to do that, I quite understand. But if you are, then think carefully about the categories of use that you might want to use to regulate your activity there, and what countries you might need to be operating and protecting your brand in if it is potentially outside the UK as well as in the UK. And then how you use and license your IP. So are there any actually commercial opportunities that you could be using to exploit the resources that you have to generate income for the organisation? And again, that comes back to thinking about particularly licensing opportunities to expand the reach and impact of your organisation. So it could be a train the trainer template, for example, where you bring additional people on board, you're upskilling them with your content and then pushing them out into the wider world to deliver your services in the way in which you would like to do that. So actually that builds on our next slide, talking about social venture examples of IP strategy. And I won't take too long here because I know we're getting a bit pushed for time. But in terms of open source, this is one that I have seen. but it's certainly not going to be right for everybody. But if actually the IP of your organisation is reliant upon a stakeholder community, you might want to think about pushing out open access to that. But then there is the flip side of that, maintaining the integrity of the materials. So perhaps there needs to be some oversight, guardianship, if you like, of those materials that you push out to ensure that they're still fit for purpose, that they're still being maintained in a fit and proper way. Much more common is the licensing, which I was just discussing about, that sort of train the trainer model. Some difficulties that arise then with that, though, perhaps is policing those rights, ensuring that third parties are not passing off your IP and materials as their own. And that's why it's actually quite important in those senses to work in tandem with branding rights. So if you are providing materials, content, copyrighted material in that sense, that it is slapped all over with your name and your branding, that you can very easily point to that being your materials. And actually, equally, if you are going for a train the trainer model of broadening out and expanding your activities, perhaps thinking about some accreditation, ensuring that those third parties are then actually still delivering services in a way that's compatible with your drive and your expectations and quality of service delivery. Equally, you may also then be thinking about selling services based on IP, and that's a little bit more behind the scenes if you want to retain a bit more or a bit less visibility, I should say, of the actual sort of underlying IP. But you're comfortable and have the resources and the scope to then go out and deliver those services yourself. And then it becomes a contractual matter, really, as to how robust we can be in terms of protecting and managing your confidentiality and IP in those circumstances. And just very quickly to thank you, Lucy, sorry. International expansion, I won't dwell on this in any detail, really, because it may not be relevant for everyone, but just a few questions there to think about. Actually, it's certainly a longer term project, not something to be rushed into, because last thing you want to do is sort of spread yourself too thin in that sense. But thinking, actually, is there a way that we look to partner with other organisations to deliver our mission and expand our reach in that sense, or whether actually we need to retain that sort of control element and try and do this ourselves. But then that begs the question of, are there sort of external regulatory and administrative formalities that we then need to think quite carefully about. So I think actually that then wraps us up, really. Yeah. So I just wanted to give a quick little shout out to, we have a service that we are operating called Virtual Pop-Ups, where we offer free half-an-hour consultations with potential social venture clients. So we have a web form, you'll see at the link there. So if any organisation or individual is more than open to use this, we just ask a few sort of prompt questions to give us a bit of steer for that conversation. But we're very happy to have those initial conversations with founders, chief execs, whoever it might be within a social organisation, to perhaps sort of shed a little bit of light on a particular legal issue that they may have been struggling to find the answers to in other resources. And you'll see this when Jane's able to circulate the slides, but we also have some helpful links for a number of the topic areas that we've covered today, which you can peruse at your leisure.
Thanks, Emma, so much really useful content. If anyone got any specific questions, so there's a small group, you're very welcome. If you've got time, you want to stay on for a couple of minutes. If Emma's got time,
yeah, of course,
you're very welcome to fire anything at Emma now. What was in the chat? Oh, no, that was Lucy, so I missed that one.
Did I see Karina's hand go up?
No.
Yeah.
Is it all right to unmute myself?
Of course.
I'm still a little bit sometimes confused when we have a social enterprise, a clique, who is limited by shares. From a funder's point of view, how would kind of generally funders consider that entity?
It depends on the funder, I think, is the slightly fudgy answer. So I'm sorry about that, but I honestly don't think there is a definitive response. Some, as I say, are, I think, becoming a little bit more conscious and aware that actually kicks, even those that have a share structure, can be delivering hugely beneficial social and environmental impact. And actually, you've got, there are a reasonably robust regulator in place, so there is certainly the credibility for the social piece. We have a fixed dividend cap, which is ensuring that 65% of those distributable profits are furthering that community objective. So some entirely will be on board with that. I think it's more just the more sort of conservative, traditional funders that might be a little bit like, oh yes, actually, but there is still the possibility of individuals to take dividends from this business, and because of that we're going to say no. But my understanding actually is that those funders that take that approach are fairly open at the outset of saying, actually, if you're a kick limited by shares, please don't apply, because we just won't consider your application. So
it's really quickly looking at the criteria whether you're actually eligible or not. Because it's obviously it's a bit of a on the face is a bit fudgy.
It is. I completely appreciate. I think it's just a case of digging, actually. And I think actually in some of the links that we've included at the end of the slides, memory serves, there should be some guides there actually that can steer you a little bit in the direction of who might be some more applicable, eligible funders for kicks of that nature.
Thank you so much, Emma. It was really useful session.
Good.
Thanks, Corinna. Elizabeth, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
I think it was really helpful, the discussion really around the change and measuring what we're doing. And I think what we need to be doing is to be thinking, yes, about the numbers, but when you make a positive impact for somebody, that's sometimes a little bit tricky to do in numbers, isn't it, really? Which is why I said about, is there other ways of doing it, other softer ways?
Yeah,
which actually might help a bit with funding, actually.
Mm-hmm. I think that personality piece is really, really helpful. So I hope there's been some good takeaways from that.
And Elizabeth, you may not have come to our impact measurement webinar we had this week. It is on our website now. So basically, we have our own toolbox that we've started for that very reason, to help people start working out what data they've got, start collecting it, getting it into a good fashion. But also the webinar is really good with Nikki, one of our directors, who talks about the soft parts that you also need to record and how you measure that change. So well worth having a look at that. It's on our website.
Good. Thank you for having me. I hope it was useful. And if you do have any further questions, then as I say, the pop-up function is available. So do feel free to get back in touch.